Welcome to Outside Source on BBC News for viewers in the UK and around the world. We are covering all the very latest coronavirus developments here in Britain and globally. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is facing a second night in intensive care for coronavirus. The government says he's in good spirits, stable and breathing without help.
He's not just the Prime Minister. For all of us in Cabinet, he's not just our boss. He's also a colleague and he's also our friend.
The UK's chief scientific advisor says it's too early to say whether the pandemic is breaking as Britain records its biggest daily jump in deaths. Stark statistics coming out of the US show the heavy toll coronavirus is having on African American communities as cases continue to climb. Wuhan, the Chinese city where the pandemic started, has reopened to the outside world after almost 3 months of this lockdown. And is the lockdown giving us more vivid dreams? We'll be talking to a specialist about how this crisis is affecting our sleep. A warm welcome to the programme. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, the man responsible for leading the UK's battle against coronavirus, has now spent nearly 24 hours in intensive care fighting COVID-19. He has asked the Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab to deputise for him. Well, a short time ago, Mr Raab gave this update on the Prime Minister's health.
I can tell you he's receiving the very best care from the excellent medical team at St Thomas's Hospital. He remains stable overnight. He's receiving standard oxygen treatment and breathing without any assistance. He's not required any mechanical ventilation or non-invasive respiratory support. He remains in good spirits and, in keeping with usual clinical practice, his progress continues to be monitored closely in critical care.
It's good to hear that he is in good spirits. Well, during this daily press briefing, we were also given the latest UK figures. So let's take a closer look. In the last day, 786 hospital patients with coronavirus have sadly died. This is the highest reported figure so far for a 24-hour period. But experts say that the growth in numbers is actually lower than the predicted long-term trend. So a little bit of positivity there. This now brings the total number of people who have died in the UK hospitals to more than 6,000. Well, let's get more from our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake, who joins us now. Jonathan, so Dominic Raab, who is deputising for the Prime Minister during that daily press briefing, he explained that he had been given very clear instructions from the Prime Minister while he remains in hospital. Do we know any more about them?
Well, the sense you got from that news conference fronted by Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, and effectively Boris Johnson's deputy, was that he was carrying out the plan that was put in place by the government before Boris Johnson fell ill. He was at pains to point out, as I think Downing Street is, that he is there facilitating the government's response and continuing along the route which was set by Boris Johnson and his senior ministers, along with advice from public health officials and scientists, and won't be doing anything to change that. He was asked repeatedly by journalists coming in via video link to the press conference what exactly his role was, how much authority he has and the capacity he has to take decisions, and at every time he referred to collective responsibility and the fact that the government was united. So I think very much the impression being given by Dominic Raab that hopefully, of course, everyone is hoping that the Prime Minister makes a speedy recovery and is able to return to work. But as the days go on, there will be decisions that need to be made, and with limited contact from the Prime Minister himself, that could become difficult.
Yes, of course, everybody is wishing him a very speedy recovery. When it comes to decisions that have to be made, one of the most difficult is whether the lockdown should continue in what kind of capacity. Do we know what kind of impact it's having?
Well, there was an indication from the Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, at that briefing that there was a glimmer of positivity. He was very careful to add caveats, but said there was some suggestion in the latest figures for hospital admissions that a flattening of the curve was beginning to occur. And that would potentially suggest that the lockdown measures, the restrictions on movement that have been in place here in the UK for a couple of weeks now, were beginning to have an effect. But in terms of those being lifted or eased in any way. Both Dominic Raab and the chief scientific advisor played down that prospect and said it was simply too early to start talking about any relaxation of those restrictions. So we don't expect that to be a decision that Dominic Raab is confronted with in the next week or so while standing in for the Prime Minister.
Jonathan, thanks for that point. Jonathan Blake there, our correspondent in Westminster. Well, let's get the latest now from mainland Europe. Let's turn to Spain because the country has seen a rise in the daily figure for coronavirus-related deaths after 4 consecutive falls. So now 743 deaths were registered in the latest tally. Authorities say that some of this number can actually be attributed to deaths which took place over the weekend but had not been recorded, so a bit of a lag there. But more people with the virus have died in Spain than any other country apart from Italy. So, which leads us on to Italy. Let's take a look at the situation there. Doctors and nurses from Romania and Norway are being deployed to those badly hit areas in the north of the country to help fight this pandemic. The teams, 35 people in total, are heading to Bergamo and to Milan. Italy now has more than 16,500 people dead. In France, the number of people who have died has surpassed 10,000. Additional measures to contain this virus are about to come into force. From Wednesday, any outdoor exercise will be banned in the capital between 10 in the morning and 7 in the evening. And all residents leaving their homes are required to carry a permission slip explaining exactly why they are outside. So just how are these new rules being welcomed? Are they being welcomed? Well, let's just have a look at this reaction.
That's what we do for everyone, with the greatest courtesy. And Parisians are very understanding. We're welcomed at the controls, there's no difficulty. For certain people, we have to explain and re-explain the manner in which to fill out the permission slip, because for some it's not always clear, but it's okay.
Frankly, it's starting to feel long. I think it's starting to really weigh down on people mentally. Apart from that, well, we know we don't have any choice. This is what must be done. We ask ourselves why these measures weren't taken earlier. Personally, I think it's quite late that they've decided to take these draconian measures.
So that's the reaction from France, where across the country there'll be those stricter measures coming in. We're just going to turn away from coronavirus very briefly because the Vatican has welcomed a decision by Australia's High Court to quash the conviction of Cardinal George Pell for child sex abuse. Cardinal Pell was released from prison and made his way to a monastery in Melbourne. The 78-year-old spent more than 400 days behind bars after he was convicted of sexually assaulting 2 choir boys back in the 1990s. But 7 High Court judges unanimously agreed that the jury ought to have entertained a doubt about his guilt. Well, in a statement, Cardinal Pell said that I hold no ill will towards my accuser. I do not want my acquittal to add to the hurt and bitterness that so many feel. There's certainly hurt and bitterness enough. He is the most senior figure who has been accused in the global scandal of historical sex abuse that has rocked the Roman Catholic Church. Well, in a statement, the Holy See said that they have always expressed confidence in the Australian Judicial Authority and that it reaffirmed its commitment to preventing and pursuing all cases of abuse against minors. Now, just hours after the news broke, Pope Francis himself offered his morning mass for all those who suffered from unjust sentences, which he compared to the persecution of Jesus. Now, this is rather a departure from the theme of masses in recent weeks. They've all been related to the coronavirus pandemic. And then there was this tweet from the Pope, which said that we've been witnessing the persecution that Jesus underwent and how he was judged ferociously, even though he was innocent. Let us pray together for all those persons who suffer due to an unjust sentence because of someone had it in for them. That's the Pontiff's tweet. Let's get the latest from our religious editor, Martin Bashir, who joins us now. Martin, An extraordinary statement from the pontiff there. How unusual is it for the Pope to get involved in something like this?
Well, for the last 2.5 years, every single time I've asked the Pope's official spokesman, Matteo Bruni, about whether Pope Francis has a view about the proceedings when Cardinal Pell was first charged, subsequently convicted, then appealed to the High Court, I was repeatedly told the Pope had nothing to say until the judicial process had completed its course. Well, it has completed its course. I would have to say to you that today's Mass, I think you may be stretching that a little bit far, because on Holy Week, the Passion of Christ, and at that Mass he was referencing directly the sufferings, the unjust sufferings of Christ up to the point of Good Friday where he was crucified. And as you rightly said, he talked about praying for all those who suffer unjust sentences. He didn't make any explicit reference to Cardinal George Pell. Subsequently, the Holy See issued that statement saying that it welcomed the High Court's decision, but he also went on to say it reaffirms its commitment to preventing and pursuing all cases of abuse against minors. Now, some people have wondered whether this indicates that Cardinal George Pell may well get another job back in Rome. He was, after all, something like the third most senior person within the entire sprawling Vatican. I think that's unlikely. He's 78 years old, and he's told friends that he actually wants to stay in Australia. But interestingly, the president of the Bishops' Conference in Australia, Archbishop Mark Coleridge, has acknowledged the deep divisions that still exist in his country. And he said this in a statement today: "Today's outcome will be welcomed by many, but will be devastating for others." So there's very little triumphalism within the church in Australia. And I think that it's most likely that Cardinal George Pell will see out the rest of his days in Australia, though it's worth keeping in mind that because he never had to hand in his red hat, he remains a cardinal, and therefore, if a papal conclave is called between now and his 80th birthday next year, he could elect the next pope.
Fascinating insight, Martin, and thank you so much for putting that into context there as well, of course. Sure. Martin Bashir, our religion editor, thank you so much. Now, I want to return back to the subject of coronavirus, of course, dominating our coverage so far. We're going to catch up with what's happening in China, because for the first time since the country began monitoring the toll of the virus epidemic back in January, officials there have reported no new deaths from this virus. New infections have also dropped, and all 32 cases reported came from overseas travellers who entered China. But there are real questions about whether the government has been under-reporting figures. Steve McDonnell is in Beijing.
Many have suggested that the figures here can't be possibly catching all the cases, neither all the infections nor the deaths. But in a way, it doesn't really matter, because really what matters is the trend. I mean, if the sort of loop goes like that or like that, it doesn't really matter how high. I mean, there could be 10 times as many people have died here as come up in the figures, but as long as the trend is right, and it does seem to be, in terms of us coming out the other end, well, it's quite instructive and offering hope for other countries.
Desperately needed hope. Well, also in the last few hours, the Chinese city of Wuhan, where this outbreak, of course, started, opened to the outside world. Restrictions there have now been lifted for the first time since the 23rd of January, when Beijing locked down the 11 million people living there. The majority of stores have reopened, residents are able to travel again, and you can see people arriving at Wuchang Station in Wuhan. In Japan, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has declared a state of emergency in Tokyo, Osaka and 5 other regions in the country. People are being advised to just stay inside and businesses will shut. Coronavirus infections in Tokyo are more than double in the past week to around 100. This comes after the government announced a massive stimulus package, which Mr. Abe described as among the world's biggest, in order to soften this economic blow. It is worth around $1 trillion US. That's around 20% of Japan's gross domestic output. Our correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes is in Tokyo.
If you take Tokyo and its surrounding areas, it really is the world's largest metropolitan area, with a population altogether of around 37 million people. So this state of emergency really does affect a vast number of people. And we understand it's going to go into effect initially for a month. But it won't be the same as the lockdowns that have been declared in the UK or in America or in some other European countries, because the Japanese government simply doesn't have the power to do that. This is an advisory. The Japanese government is requesting that businesses close. It's requesting that ordinary citizens stay at home as much as possible. But a lot of life will continue to go on. The Tokyo transportation network will continue to run. A lot of people will continue to go to work. But it's hoped, but because this is a disciplined and law-abiding society, that it will be enough to stem the growth of COVID-19 here.
Well, thanks to Rupert for talking us through that. Stay with us here on Outside Source. We'll be looking at whether coronavirus is in fact playing havoc on our sleep. We'll get the latest from a dream expert about the impact of lockdown on our subconscious. It's been more than 3 weeks since Croatia suspended school and university because of the pandemic. However, one teacher has found a unique way to deliver lessons.
This is a music lesson with a difference. The musician, a teacher. The audience, his pupils.
I'm in 3rd grade.
I'm in grade 6.
I don't go to school yet.
2 days ago, I visited and sang to 8 of them. Today, this is my 3rd stop, and I have arrangements for 10 more. Not just here in the centre, but to other areas as well, because the kids had to move out of their homes after the earthquake. Some even live outside the city, but I have to go and see them too.
I take my hat off to the teacher for the initiative, especially in the time when we must not go out. It means a lot for their motivation.
Welcome back. You're watching Outside Source from the BBC. Our main story: the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson is facing a second night in intensive care for coronavirus. The government says that he is in good spirits, stable and breathing without help. Let's bring you up to date with the situation in the United States, where New York continues to be at the very centre of the COVID-19 outbreak. Now, speaking in just the last few hours, the New York Governor, Andrew Cuomo, said that Monday saw the largest single increase in the number of people who have died.
The bad news is 5,489 New Yorkers have lost their lives to this virus. That is up from 4,758. That is the largest single-day increase. And we talk about numbers, but that's 731 people who we lost. Behind every one of those numbers is an individual, is a family, is a mother, is a father, is a sister, is a brother. So a lot of pain, again today, for many New Yorkers, and they're in our thoughts and prayers.
Yes, absolutely crucial to remember the individuals behind those huge figures. There are, however, some promising signs, because statistics which were released by New York City's emergency department show that the number of patients who are admitted with coronavirus-like symptoms has in fact slowed, as you can see on this chart. Near the end of last month, over 1,500 people were being admitted to New York's A&E departments, but that has in fact dropped down to 500. Well, Mark Levine, chair of the New York City Health Council Committee, says that this shows that the isolating measure put in place in New York is in fact paying off. Now, also developing in the US today, new statistics on how African-American communities have been hit by COVID-19. As of Sunday, 1,824 African-American Chicago residents have been diagnosed with COVID-19. Now, they make up just over half of all coronavirus cases in the city, but African Americans only make up 30% of the population in Chicago, so disproportional there. And when it comes to coronavirus deaths in Chicago, African Americans account for 2/3. Well, let's dissect this with the BBC's Anthony Zerka, who joins us in Washington. So a disproportionate figure when it comes to African Americans being affected by coronavirus, Anthony.
Yes, and you're seeing that not just in Chicago, but also in other major cities as well. Detroit and New Orleans in particular, also in Connecticut, New York. There are only a handful of states reporting these figures based on race, but the ones that have shown similar disparities. The question is, why is that the case? And some of the possible answers are that African Americans could be more predisposed or may have more pre-existing conditions like hypertension and obesity and breathing difficulties that could be complicated when they come down with the coronavirus. They may not have as good access to healthcare providers. Also, some workers could be still going to their jobs, may not have access to the same amount of protection. They could be deemed essential workers in places like grocery stores and in medical facilities. All of this could be playing into why we're seeing these larger differences between African Americans, fatalities, and the general population.
And Anthony, again, when it comes to disproportionality, we're seeing New York being hugely affected, New York State, when it compares to the rest of the United States.
Right. New York State is still the hot spot for coronavirus in the United States, although there are now predictions that here in Washington, D.C., the numbers are starting to go up dramatically and that it could become the next hot spot. I think the concern is that New York was hit first. New York City was hit first. You saw the trajectory of cases there, and that sort of trajectory can be matched in other U.S. cities somewhere down the line. So not just Washington, D.C., but Miami, Houston, Dallas, of course, Detroit is seeing this, New Orleans is seeing this, and if those cities follow the same trajectory as New York City, that's how you get into the projected hundreds of thousands of deaths. They're still saying that a peak in the virus in the United States is looking at the middle of April. They've adjusted it by a couple of days maybe, but it still seems like the predictions that this next week, particularly in New York, are going to be the darkest for the United States with this pandemic.
Indeed. Thank you, Anthony. As always, Anthony Zerka there in Washington. Thank you. Well, more than 1.3 million people have coronavirus worldwide, but the impact, as we all know, goes far beyond just those who've been infected. Lockdowns across the world are affecting billions of people. And while the stress of this pandemic is causing some to have sleepless nights, others are in fact experiencing the very opposite, more vivid dreams. Well, let's talk to Mark Blagrove, who's a professor of psychology at Swansea University, and you specialise, Professor, in dreams. I'm assuming that dreams, they show us what's going on in our subconscious, and when we are under this kind of stress scenario, that's really coming through what we're doing, what we're thinking of at night.
Yes, that's quite true. Some of the time they will show our subconscious things that we may not be quite so conscious of. But at the moment, a lot of people will be having the quite obvious stresses that they've got in waking life, and they may very well dream of those stresses. And added to that is the fact that because they can sleep in the morning, they have a greater amount of rapid eye movement sleep across the morning, even up to about 40 minutes of it you could have near the end of the night. And this can lead to very long dreams and far more dreams being recalled.
And if people are having anxiety and perhaps leading on to nightmares, is there any way of controlling what's going on when we then fall asleep eventually?
One thing that we're finding is that if people talk about the nightmares to other people or talk about the dreams, because in some instances they'll be having dreams which aren't quite nightmares, or for some people who may be having a relaxed time in the lockdown, they may be having quite pleasant dreams. But what we're finding at Swansea is the benefits of sharing your dreams with other people. So this goes beyond any benefits that there may be to the individual for considering their own dreams, but the sharing with others gives a self-disclosure And what we're finding in our experiments is that the person you share the dreams with can end up having more empathy towards you. And the present situation with the lockdown, there's not only more time for dreaming, but there's more time for sharing dreams in the day.
Now, we don't have too much time, but should we be reading anything too much into these dreams if we've got a recurring dream or something that keeps coming back to us?
Well, at the moment, what we did at the weekend was we discussed with a nurse who was having COVID about a recurrent dream that she's having. And the dream was quite transparent in a way. It was to do with the outside world being threatening, people inside the house at a party she was at not wanting to know what the warnings she was given were, and then her seeing a dead body, and then her having a cat on her face suffocating her. So the dreams can be quite transparent, but they can tell you about your life in a sort of metaphorical way, and metaphors about your life can be quite enlightening.
Mark, thank you so much for talking us through that. It's a fascinating insight. Professor Blager from Swansea University, a dream expert. Thank you. And if anybody is experiencing any more lucid or vivid dreams, do get in touch with us. The hashtag is BBCOS. It would be great to hear from you. I'll be back with the next edition of the show very shortly. Stay safe.